Yeah.
Still here at 9 o'clock today.
Sorry?
You're still doing
Yes. Okay, let's begin. Okay, so today we are going to discuss ultimately what a person could or should do in a situation where, let's say, the Eruv is down. Okay, this happens. The Eruv could go down, or you're in a place without an Eruv. And so we're not going to talk about wearing keys as jewelry, but we are going to talk about, is there a way to leave a key, let's say, under the mat outside the house to then open the door? Can you do that, right? Is that going to be allowed? Is that not allowed? Hide the key somewhere near the door and then use the key, open the door. Is that allowed? Not allowed? How to do so? That's what we're going to ultimately discuss. We're going to go through a couple of different scenarios, but ultimately, let's think of that case. I think that's the most practical case for us, and then we'll come back to it. So we're on 101b1, Tanar Rabbanan. Okay, we have a brisa which discusses this halacha further. Okay, so remember, there's a debate over here between Rameir and the Rabbanan about whether a person's allowed to stand in one domain and do something in another domain, like carry something in another domain. Rabbanan said yes, Rameir says no. So Tanar Rabbanan, the rabbis taught as follows: Pischei Sharigina, a person has a door of a garden. Okay, so the garden is a carmelis, and this door goes between the garden, the carmelis, and a public domain, right? So garden, public domain, and there's a door between them, okay? Simple enough. When they have a gatehouse on the inside, okay, there's a booth, which is a private domain. Then poseach v'nom mibifnim, a person's allowed to unlock and lock the gates from the inside from that private domain. Okay, mibachutz poseach v'nom mibachutz. If the gatehouse is on the outside, then they're allowed to unlock and lock from the outside. Mikan, if there's a gatehouse on each side, poseach v'nol kan v'kan, then you're allowed to lock and unlock from either side. Okay, so what this means is as follows. Let's say you have it's going to be a bird's eye view. Okay, so here you have your garden over here, which is a carmelis. Okay, so this is a carmelis, okay, and then you have your public domain over here. Okay, full-fledged public domain, public. Okay, so then you have your doorway over here. Okay, here's your door. Okay, there's your door. And the question is, but in addition to the carmelis in this, you have a little booth, which is going to be a private domain. Okay, this is a private. Whatever. Okay, so basically, if it's the private domain is over here, then you're allowed to open the lock from here. If there's a private domain over here, you're allowed to open it from here. If there's on both sides, you can open it on either side. Okay, fine. So far, so good. Let's go a little further. Fine. Ein lehen lo lakan v'lakan. If there is no gatehouse, if there's no little door, no little room, individual room, then asur kan v'kan. Then you're not allowed to open it on either side, because basically what you're going to be doing is you're going to be standing in. Oh, one important point that I omitted. And now let's just look at the door from the door itself. Now here we're going to zoom in into the door. This is the door. This is the lock that the door stands in. So it is above 10 tefachim, okay? And it's 4 tefachim wide, okay? So why is that significant? Because if it's above 10 tefachim and it's 4 tefachim wide, we're going to treat this like a reshus hayachid, a private domain, okay? And that's part of this whole discussion. And because basically this door, this key, like this place where the key goes in, this is going to be a private domain, and that's why if there's no box over here, then basically you're going to be putting your key from your carmelis into the door, and that's going from a carmelis into a private domain. Can't do that. If there's no private box over here, and you're going from the public domain to the door, then you're going from public domain to a private domain. You can't do that. But if there is this box over here, then this is a private domain. You're putting into the door, into the keyhole, which is in, because again it's 4 tefachim wide, 10 tefachim high. Therefore, it's a private domain as well. Make sense? Meaning the door itself, the box, the door itself, there's this thing is jutting out. Okay, we'll make it a little, right? Okay, whatever. Okay, it's not happening. But basically, there's a box that's sticking out of the door. Okay? That's annoying. Okay, yeah, fine. You can't see it, but you know what I mean. Basically, this box is sticking out, and it's 4 and 10 above. Therefore, it's a private domain, and therefore, again, if there's no private box over here, then you're going from a carmelis to a private domain. You can't do it. But once there's this box, private domain to private domain, private domain to private domain, that's why it's going to be allowed. Okay. Now, keep in mind as we come back to our question, our doors, our key, our locks are not like this. Our locks are typically just a small little thing in the door itself, and they are not 10 high. They might be 10 high. Probably depends on the door. They might be 10 high, but they're certainly not 4 wide. It's just a little thing jutting out, right? So we'll come back to that. But the point is that their keyholes are typically going to be in a box, which is therefore considered a private domain onto its own. Okay? Says the Gemara further. V'chein, the Brisa continues. V'chein chanuyos hapsuchos l'shus rabim. Similarly, you have a store that's open to the public domain. Bisman shamanu lemata me'asara. If the lock of the door is below 10 tvachim. Now, if it's below 10 tvachim, if it's above 10 tvachim, then it's considered a private domain. If it's below 10 tvachim, then it's it's not a public domain because it's not in the public domain proper, but it is not a private domain, and therefore it is a carmelis. So then maybe maftech me'erev Shabbos. You're allowed to bring the key before Shabbos. Umanicho beskupa. You leave it on the threshold, okay, which is also a karmelis. Okay, lemachar posech v'noel, and the next day you're allowed to take the key, unlock and lock the door, umachzir leskupa, and then put it back in its place. Okay, so what that means is as follows. So basically, now we're talking about a case where it is you're no longer. What's the case? The case is okay. So here is okay, you're in the public domain. Okay, and if your lock is lower than 10 tefachim, so now this door is going to be the lock in this door is going to be considered a karmelis, right? Basically, you have this lock in this door is going to be a karmelis. Over here, this is okay. This lock is going to be a karmelis, and thank you to Ross. Okay. Get in there. Okay. Now you got a purple door. Exciting. Okay. Okay. So basically, this. Oh wow. Okay. So this door is going to be a karmelis because it's lower than 10 tefachim. Okay. It's lower than 10 tefachim, and basically, what happens is if you have a scoop in front of it, this is a scoop, like a stoop. Excuse me, stoop, which is also going to be a karmelis. Right, then you could put the key into the door, unlock it, and then put it back into the stoop because you're going from a karmelis to a karmelis.
You're talking about the location of the lock in the door?
Talking about the key. There's the key over here on the stoop. Okay, that's your key. Okay, and then the door itself, the lock is basically considered a karmelis because it is in the door, which is facing the public space, facing this karmelis, and therefore this lock is basically considered a karmelis.
Okay.
Yep.
The lock itself.
The lock itself. The lock itself. Correct. That thing. Exactly. Okay. Good. Which is going to be most similar to our locks in a typical case, right? We'll have to come back to. But in a typical case, if our Eruv goes down, right, then your street is a karmelis. Your street is not a full-fledged public domain. I don't care what street you live in. None of you are living on a full-fledged public domain. You're living in a karmelis. Outside of your house is a karmelis, right? So this case would actually probably be the most similar to our case. I may as well just spell it out now. And that is if you want. So again, you could put on the whole jewelry key thing, or you could go ahead and place your key under the mat, let's say, okay, karmelis, pick it up, open your lock, put it back there. Don't open the door yet, because if you open the door, then you just brought the key from a karmelis into the private domain. Open the door, put the key back under the mat, you're good to go, right? Because basically, on Shabbos without an Eruv. Sorry?
Why don't we all have Shabbos logs? Everybody should.
Okay, that's always a very practical answer, but not everyone does. Not everyone does, right? So, okay. But yes, agreed. I have one too. Okay. Sorry? Karmelis is a non, meaning biblically there is a full-fledged public domain, a very busy street. There is a private domain, enclosed area. Everything, most things in between, which don't feel like your street over here is considered a karmelis, basically because it's not, or even this parking lot is seen as a karmelis, or your front yard is seen as a karmelis because I'm assuming whatever a front yard that's not fenced in is going to be a karmelis. A street is going to be a karmelis if it's not so busy. The parking lot over here is going to be a karmelis. So most things are in our modern world. Most things in our residential area is going to be considered karmelises. Okay, so let's go further. You have a store that opens into the public domain. When the lock is lower than 10 tefachim, and therefore it's a karmelis, maybe maftech Shabbos, you place a key before Shabbos. You place it on the threshold or the stoop. The next day you can pick up the key, unlock or lock the door. And you put it back to the threshold. When the lock is above 10 tefachim, and therefore again with their dimensions above 10 tefachim and 4 tefachim wide, and therefore the lock box, we'll call it the lock box, I guess, I don't know, whatever, is going to be considered a private domain. Then maybe maftech me'erev Shabbos, you place the key before Shabbos. You place it on top of the lock. The lock box itself is Rishus Yachid, and therefore you place it on top of it, and therefore you're placing it in a private domain. The next day you could take the key, unlock and lock the door, and place it back on top of the lock. Divrei Meir, these are the words of Meir. The Chacham say no. Even when the lock is above 10 tefachim, maybe maftech me'erev Shabbos, you're allowed to place the key before Shabbos and place it on the threshold. And the next day you're allowed to take the key and unlock the door, and put it back in its place. The Gemara is going to discuss this in a moment. Pesach, or you're allowed to place the key in a windowsill above the doorway. We're on 101b2, which is less than 4 tefachim wide, and therefore it's a makom pitur. Okay, makom pitur is basically, remember, makom pitur is any situation where it's mostly going to be like small spaces, typically. Places which are going to have, like, it might be like 10 tefachim high, but it is, which once you hit 10 tefachim, you are no longer Rosh Hashanah, but it's not wide, it's very narrow, and therefore it's called a makom pitur. So what you would be allowed to do is take the key, unlock the door, and place it in a window which is above the door, which is a makom patur. However, if the window still measures 4 by 4, if it's 4 by 4, then it's going to have 4 tefachim. It's going to be Rosh Hashanah, in which case you can place the key there because you're going from the threshold, which is a Carmelis, to the window, which is a private domain. Okay, now the Gemara, let's hold off on discussing the last part. The Gemara is going to analyze the last part in a second. The Brisa said similarly stores. Remember, the Brisa started off by talking about a garden, and then it transitioned to talking about stores. So Miklaldi skupas karmelis askinan. That must mean that just like the garden was talking about a carmelis, so too the threshold in front of the house is, we're talking about, it has the dimensions of a carmelis, and therefore the Gemara now asks, Hai manol hechidami. The lock that we're talking about, what lock are we talking about? Like, what are the dimensions of the lock? If the lock is less than 4 tefachim wide, then it's a mekom pitur. A makom patur, we generally have a rule that a person is allowed to move things from a makom patur to Rosh Hashanah or makom patur to Rosh Hashanah. And therefore, the Gemara is questioning, why does your mayor not allow the lock, the key that is sitting on the threshold, to be used to open the door if the threshold is a makom patur? With me? In other words, again, this is skupa. They have a threshold. You have a thing before the house with stoop. We don't know the dimensions of the stoop. All it says is there's a stoop. Okay, so dimensions are unknown. All we know is that there's a stoop over here. If it's a very narrow stoop, okay, then it's going to be called a makom patur. Makom patur, literally from the word exempt, means you're allowed to move things from a public domain to a makom patur, from a private domain to a makom patur. So why would a mayor say you can't use the key if it's very narrow, in which case it's a makom patur? Why would a mayor say you cannot use the key to open the door? You're going from a exempt place, from a permitted place, to a Rosh Hashanah, let's say, should be fine, right? So therefore, why would our mayor say it's forbidden? And now the Gemara says, "The is be'arba, if it does have 4 tefachim, b'hal lemar rabbanan, af bizman shamanu l'mal me'asara." If it has 4 tefachim, then would the rabbis really say that when the lock is above 10 tefachim, and therefore it's Rosh Hashanah, maybe maftech me'er Shabbos, u'menicha b'skupa, l'machar posech menobo, would you really be allowed to go ahead and take the key from the threshold, which is now considered a carmelis because it's 4 tefachim wide, and open the door, or put it into the lock, which is a private domain, mafsil l'skupa, then take it from the box, take it from the lock, and put it back on the threshold, or in a windowsill which is above the doorway, if it's 4 tefachim wide, you would then be going from a carmelis, i.e. the threshold, to the private domain, right? So if it's narrow, it's a makom patur, and even Rameir should say you're allowed to go from the stoop to the door. If it's wide, and therefore a carmelis, how did the Rabbanan say that I'm allowed to take the key, put it into the door, and then put it into a window which is a private domain? I'd be going from a carmelis to a private domain. In other words, with the rabbis earlier, all they said is I'm allowed to go. What we saw in Torah was the rabbi said, I'm allowed to stand in the public domain and move something in the private domain. I can't take something from the private domain and move it into the public domain, right? All they said is I'm allowed to keep it there. But in this brisa, they're saying I'm allowed to take the key from the carmelis, put it into the door, i.e. private domain, right? Or put it into the window. I just went from a potentially what we're now describing as a carmelis and putting it into a private domain. How's that allowed, right? So what exactly are the dimensions of the store? So Marabaya, the Gemara says, next column 101b2, La'olam de'ein barba, we're talking about a door which does not have, the lock does not have 4 tefachim, okay? And therefore, it should not be considered a private domain. Okay, it should be considered makom patur. But the door is thick enough to allow one to carve into it to complete the surface of 4 tefachim. Look at the picture below. There's one picture on the page. I'm not going to try to copy it because it's a hard picture to draw. You see that? Basically, see that where that empty hole is? You see that where that gap is? You see there's one picture on page 101b2. You want to see it? Yeah? So that little hole behind the lock is actually not there. It's an imaginary hole. Okay? And basically what this, yeah. Right. Okay. I'll draw it in a different way, which might make it easier to understand. So basically, I'm going to draw it from the side view. Okay. Here is your door. Okay. This is your door. It's 4 tefachim wide. Okay. It's 2 tefachim wide. Okay. It's 2 tefachim wide. And then here is your lock. Okay. Which is 2 tefachim wide. Okay. Now 2 tefachim. on its own. Now, this is the lock. So if it's 2 tvachim, is this a domain onto its own? No, it should be a makom patur because it needs, in order to be a domain onto its own, rishus yachid, it needs to be 4 tvachim wide. Okay. Now, Rameir has a halacha that we saw already a couple of times in Eruvin and in Shabbos, that in a situation where there is the potential to drill in, there's the potential space, we treat it as if you have that space. So Rameir basically says, even though this is really only, the surface over here is only 2 tvachim, but since theoretically a person could go ahead and drill in over here and take out this this space over here, right, and remove this space, which would end up happening is that this lock would now have a surface of 4 tvachim, right? Remember, Rameir had this halacha in, you have an arch when it comes to mezuzah, right? So let's say this is 10 tvachim high. This is 10 tvachim high, but over here it's only like 8 tvachim high, right? So Rameir said, since you could theoretically go like this, right, and still have the space of 10 tvachim, therefore you would need a mezuzah. The Rabbanan would say no. At the end of the day, you only have space of 8. Rameir has this idea that as long as you have the potential to remove it, it's going to be considered as if it's done. Yeah.
Why don't we consider the lock part of the door? I mean, the way that we do the way the locks are now, they're clearly part of the door.
And therefore what? It's part of the door, and therefore?
Well, then you worry about the length and the width of the door. Right?
You're saying at the end of the day, it's attached. It's one entity, and therefore look at the entire
Door. And so
thing.
if the door is more than 10 tvachim high, then you got a problem no matter where the lock is.
But the lock isn't really, because they replaced your lock without replacing the door. I don't know, it seems, and you get a different lock, a Shabbos lock.
I have
Pushing it.
in my house.
Okay, you're saying the dimensions. Why do we break this thing into 2, so to speak, halachically, and look at it only as a standalone? Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I need to think it through with more coffee. I'm not sure. Sorry. My slow release pill that I took last night is still kicking in. 9:15, 9:16, 9:18. Anyone? Sometime tonight. Yeah, it's gonna be a while. Okay, I fear. I'm not sure. Okay, so again, let's read it. There is not 4 tvachim. But there is the thickness of the door to carve into it to complete to 4. And this is Rameir and Rabbanan who argue about this point elsewhere. Rameir holds in general you're allowed to carve into complete, like I drew over here. Rabbanan Savri and Chokin Lahashna. Rabbanan say no. If it's carved already, great. If it's not, we don't do this imaginary thing. Nothing to talk about. Amar Bibi Bar Abaye Shmamina Maha Mesnisa Tzlas. We can learn 3 lessons from this brisa. 1, Shema Mina Chokin Lahashlim. We learn from this brisa that at least according to some, that you are allowed, that you do this concept of carving to complete the necessary dimensions, like Rameir. Shmamina Hadar Bei Rameir Mishari Gina. We learn that Rameir retracted his ruling on garden gates. Okay, meaning that Rameir over here in this brisa is permitting a person to go ahead and be in a karmelis and move objects in the rishus hayachid. Okay, V'shmas Mina Rabbanan Isla Rav Dimi, and we also could infer from this brisa that the rabbis agreed to Rav Dimi. What halacha of Rav Dimi? Dechi Asa Rav Dimi Am Rav Yochanan, because when Rav Dimi came and the Chias Rav Dimi Amar Rav Yochanan Makom, he said Makom Shem Bar Bal Arba, a place which has less than 4 by 4 tvachim. I am a kompetor. Mutul of Neirishus Ram Neirishus Yachid Lechativ Alav. The people in the private domain or in the public domain are allowed to use the place which is less than 4, and that came out of this brisa as well. That Uvad Shleichlifu, as long as you don't exchange. In other words, what came out of this brisa as well is that if you have a key coming from a private domain or a public domain, you're allowed to put it into a Makom Patur, and from vice versa, you're allowed to put it into Makom Patur, as long as you don't put it from a private domain into Makom Patur, then someone takes it from public domain and brings it into public domain, that it's going to be problematic, but otherwise going to be okay. So again, the 3 lessons are: 1, Chokin Lahashlim, this idea of the jutting in; B, Rab Meir, who initially we thought that he also prohibited things. Remember, at least according to Rava's reading yesterday, that he prohibited moving things. If you're standing in a karmelis, you're not allowed to move things in a public domain. In this brisa over here, he indicates that you are allowed to move it. It's only if you actually move it from the karmelis into the public domain, or from the karmelis to the private domain. But if you're standing in the public domain, you're allowed to move something from into a karmelis. Okay, and 3, this idea that you're allowed to move something from a private domain to a Makom Patur to a public domain, and that is all okay. Okay, now the Gemara is going to talk about a type of lock, so a type of bolt. Bless you. So basically what we have over here is a scenario where there are doors, and sometimes the way that people want to hold a door into place permanently is they'll stick like a stick into the door to really make it stay. Okay, so basically sometimes, in other words, you have doors where you want to have like a lock where you're going to open and close it, right? So you have different types of locks. Some locks are going to be like it goes down and blocks it. Sometimes you're going to have something which you just like jut into like a little bit of empty space, and that prevents it, like kind of like there's a little hole in the floor. You stick a piece of wood, and sometimes it could be understood that person's going to do it permanently. Maybe it's not the front door, it's a side door, it's a back door, and they don't want to be using it anymore. So they'll stick something in there. Now, one of the topics we've been touching upon over here in these last few discussions is bona, right? That there are problems where if a person adds something permanent to a structure on Shabbos, then you just built on Shabbos. That is certainly going to be Aser Midaraisa. But there's certain things which look like you're building, and therefore are going to be Aser Midarabanan. Okay? So placing something which may be interpreted to be something that's going to stay permanently, when people may see it and think, oh, I'm adding to the structure, that might be an issue of rabbinic building. Okay, so I'm going to see the exact case. Neger sheyesh barosho galustra, a bolt that has a knob on it. What that means is you have a bolt. This is your bolt, which is going to stick into the door. Okay, so this is your bolt, but at the top it has like this thing over here, and this thing over here. So this is your bolt, okay, whatever, yeah. But this thing over here also, keep in mind, back in the day, they didn't have like 100 utensils. This thing could also be used to crush like spices. You know, they would like crush things, right? They'd have a pestle, thank you, exactly. So, Neger sheyesh barosho gulustra, a bolt that has a knob on it. Rabbi Eliezer Oser. Rabbi Eliezer says you can't use it to bolt a door on Shabbos. Rabbi Yossi Matzah, Rabbi Yossi says it's fine. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, we'll see why in a moment. Amar Rabbi Eliezer said, Ma'aseh b'chnes she'b'Tveria shu nogam heter. Rabbi Eliezer said, to support himself, there was a shul in Tveria where they used this type of bolt on Shabbos. Ad shebar Gamliel v'azkenim v'asur lehen. And then Gamliel said, it's forbidden. So you see, it's clearly forbidden. Rabbi Yossi says, no, Isser Nagbo, you have the story wrong. They used to say they can't do it. Gamliel came along and said it's permitted to be used. So basically, they're both using the same story. They knew there's a story with a bolt with a thing on the top of it, and no one knows the exact scenario of the story. Now the Gemara says, what's going on over here? So the Gemara says like this: "Benitzal beigdo, if the bolt can be picked up by a cord to which it's tied, kuliyama lo pligi, everyone says it's allowed. In other words, if this thing has a string, okay, string." Okay, that's a string. And it's attached to the wall, okay? And it's a string where it's easy. You just pull the string and this thing comes out. Then everyone understands it's part of the structure. No one sees it like building. It's part of the structure. So similarly, the same way you're allowed to open and close a window on Shabbos because it's part of the structure, right? You're not building. The window was open for a week and now you're closing it. Too bad. It's considered part of the structure. Keep pligi when they argue on 102A1. B'she'enu nitzal be'igdo, when the bolt cannot be picked up by the cord. Okay, it's a very weak cord. Demar savar. Rav Yossi holds. Kevan diyesh barosho glustra. Since there is a knob at the end, this thing over here, which can be used for another purpose. Torah's kli alav. We treat it like a full-fledged utensil, and it's not seen as construction. In other words, people say, oh, this thing, of course you're not going to leave it here because it's a utensil. You're going to be using it later on to break your, not on Shabbos, but you're going to use it as a pestle. And therefore they see you using it, they say, you're not leaving it here forever. Umar Savar and Rabbi Eliezer, who says it's forbidden, since it can't be picked up by the cord, even though it has another function, we say no, since it can't be moved easily, we therefore say, oh, you're going to be leaving it here, you're therefore building, and therefore it is usher. Okay, we'll come back to further discussions, but again, just to go back to the case that we started off with, on Shabbos, if there is no Eruv, a person would be allowed, and certainly in our doors, a person would be allowed to leave a key under a mat, right by their house. You don't want to move it for more than 4 amos, but basically right by the door, you put your key under the mat before Shabbos or whatever, yeah, and then basically you can't go from your house on Shabbos, private domain, and put it in under the mat on Shabbos. That would be going from private domain to a Carmelist. But if you know the Eruv is not going to be up before Shabbos, put a key under your mat, and then on Shabbos you pick up the mat, you open the door, you undo the lock, don't push the door open, because then you just took something from a Carmelist to a Rosh Hashanah. You undo the lock, take the key, put it back under your mat, and then open the door, and you are good to go.